Right. Hey, everyone, I'm Klloo. So, we've got one last hero to talk about when it comes to high seas, but we have to go back to waiting, right, for the next batch of spoilers to drop. That is, of course, Gravy Bones. So, before we jump into him, it is pretty evident that the running theme of high seas is draw and gold. So, it does make me a little bit curious as to what exactly the staple generic will be for the set. So, for instance, with heavy hitters, we got Ripple Away, with the interaction there being to disrupt the token generation that was featured in heavy hitters. Part the mismount, the weakest link, interrupt chi, or even instance. Truce for Rosetta, cut through the facade, I guess, is also there for aura disruption. So I guess there's a little bit of play around Runeblade, play around Wizard. But then, of course, with the Hunted, Shelter from the Storm is by far the big one because it's just an all-around high-value card, but then obviously the prevention to get around those fours, right, that Assassin can throw out nastily, or, the pings of weapons by Fang and Syndra. So for high seas, obviously to me, it has to be something that impedes draw, which also means that as just a quality generic, it is going to be very, very impactful because we'd still have, obviously, other heroes or just draw cards in general outside of the big three of high seas that are all very, very high intellect classes, is what we'll go with, right? So we've looked at Puffin and we've looked at Marlin, and they're both basically 5 intellect heroes in their own way. Puffin, you get your value back by playing your 2 items and converting it back into a card, or through gold conversion to Cogs and Poly, right? And then Marlin, gold to a Harpoon, which is just a straight extra card in your hand. It's an attack that you can play. It's not overly statted, right? It's a little under, I'd say, but it's still useful nonetheless, and in that sense, gets us to that 5 intellect, and we can use it in a few different ways. But when it comes to Gravy Bones, right, where does he sit? Well, instant tap, destroy gold you control to draw a card, then discard a card. So, straight away, that's just straight cycle, which is still fairly decent. But then we have his other big mechanic, which is Watery Graves. So, if a blue card has been put into your graveyard this turn, you may play cards with Watery Grave from your graveyard. So this means that the interaction goes like this. We tap Gravy Bones, we convert gold into a card from the deck, and then we discard a card to our graveyard. If that card is blue, we're then enabled to play cards with Watery Grave from our graveyard. So in the case of Diamond Amulet, for instance, discarding it is a blue, so we get to play Watery Grave, and then it having Watery Grave means our hand is now basically 5 cards, right? Even though we've discarded one, we're still able to play it from the graveyard. So what this actually functionally means is, depending on how built up your graveyard is, Gravy Bones can technically be a 6 intellect hero, right? We maintain the 4 cards in hand, we cycle using gold in his effect, and then we have the potential to play 2 cards from our graveyard, right? So we have our Compass of Sunken Depth, which is the first card with Watery Grave you play from your graveyard each turn, gets Go Again, which, another thing worth noting there, although you don't get the action point from Go Again by playing on your opponent's turn, this does sort of indicate, through Gravy Bones' ability and Compass's wording, that we will have some level of play from the graveyard even on our opponent's turn. But altogether, that is 6 cards of value, right? So we can play a Watery Grave card, such as Chum, use Compass's effect to give it Go Again, and then follow up with another ally to set up a nice big board nice and quickly, right? And just in terms of value, that's already 7 extra life, essentially, onto our hero, right? Because our opponent wants to clear them, they have to clear them by completely draining their life. So, yeah, that is interesting, because 6 cards, or at least the flexibility to utilize 6 cards, again, we pitch them, so we're still maintaining our value, because I don't necessarily think that any of the Necromancer allies that we've seen so far are understated, right? So, pitching from hand to then play from graveyard is basically the same thing. We're not milling ourselves either, because we're still playing the cards we discard, and we're definitely cycling a lot of cards through pitching. So altogether, he's not going to suffer in the vein of, say, Mech, where we're boosting away cards and we are going to fatigue heavily. He's just going to have a lot of value and a lot of options until you get through the big hurdle that is his allies. So depending how many LSS do decide to print, he is definitely going to be scary. Now, comparison's sake, so he's definitely similar to our Illusionist friends, so Dromite and Prism, right? But I want to look at their actual allies. So as Dromite, we have our Invoke Dragons, and as Prism, we have our Figments that you then flip into our Angels. So both of these, to me, are already significantly more balanced than Gravy Bones. So, for instance, the majority of dragons still suffer from Phantasm. You need to play extra things to get around that, right? Be it set up the correct Ash or have the correct dragon on board to take away Phantasm. But, generally speaking, they can be popped and therefore easily destroyed without actually having to deal the full brunt of their HP. As for Prism, well, we have the startup cost. You have to land that Herald, put it into your soul, find your Figment, and then still pay 2 to activate your Figment into an Angel. So regardless of the cost on the Figments, you're still most likely paying 2 to get your Angel onto the board. As Gravy, we are paying the cost of the allies, yes, so for instance, Chum, 4 cost, and Rigor Mortis 1, but I feel like their stat line is definitely a lot more in line. So again, Phantasm to pop dragons, and then in the case of Angels, we have Ward, right? And Ward itself is a bit more difficult to sort of measure, because even though it's Ward 4, for instance, so that should be prevent 4 damage, obviously if 1 damage gets across and you have to pop your Angel, then that's insane value for your opponent, right? Whereas if 1 damage gets across, that 1 damage can only deal with a 1 health minion or a minion that has been reduced to 1 health in the case of Gravy Bones. The other caveat we have is dragons, right? There's no swing cost, although we do have to get that go again proc if we do want to string them together, but angels do all have that 2 cost. And then when it comes to our allies, we have essentially it being statted towards their damage. So 4, for instance, there's no cost, 6 at 1 cost, and I assume if we see something like an 8, for instance, it will have that 2 cost in order to activate their action and attack. The only difference is that we do tap, and is that really a big demand, right, versus just the once per turn attack that we normally see? So altogether, when we start examining them in terms of the actual cost basis, so for our Optime, we've spent 6 for his 6 body. It can attack for 6, and it can deal up to 12 depending on how its ability resolves, right? If you actually hit 3 red cards. So it's still huge damage, but again, it has that drawback of being poppable. As for our Archangel of Ravagers, we spent 2 for a 1 to 4 body. Again, if damage gets across, it gets popped. It attacks for 4 and can deal up to 6 through its Arcane Pop, right? But it costs 2 to swing. So in that case, a 2 for 6, that is just normal stat line, right? But when it comes to Sawbones, we've spent 2 for a 2 to 3 body, right? Because it has that prevention. And we're paying 1 to attack for 6. So already to me, right, just straight up compared to Prism and our Figment, we have cheaper cost all around, right? It's equivalent to play 2 and 2. It depends how much you value actually finding the specific Figment / our allies. Remember, you can take 3 of the allies. The Figments are 1 apiece, but you can find them through Prism. But then, to compensate, Prism is also a 32 health hero versus Gravy Bones, who will be a full 40 health hero, right? And then we have a 1 for 6 if we are swing with it. Now, it doesn't have Go Again. So far, we have no indication that Gravy Bones will have an easy way to generate Go Again. I would highly assume that his weapon is at least going to be 1 instance of Go Again for your allies, which is still going to be hugely impactful because they all seem like they are functionally dynamic and have these utility effects. So altogether, Gravy Bones compared to Dromai or Prism, right? We've got that high health. We don't have the general weaknesses of Illusionists like Phantasm or Ward being able to pop through different ratios of damage. We have greater utility in some aspects to some of these allies. We have quite the plethora of them, right? We have the fact that, again, in terms of playing them, you have that big intellect boost as long as you are maintaining that gold. And then to add on to all that, we have this other form of flexibility, which is if we can't really attack with them, as long as we've assembled a board state, we're getting value from them through other cards, right? We have Hoist Them Up, Paddle Faster, and Board the Ship all having a clause to tap an ally that we control to gain some level of buff, right? So Hoist Them Up becomes a 5 block if we're not utilizing an ally. So in the case of something like, for instance, Rigor Mortis, that doesn't have that utility effect, well, he now becomes a perfect tap target to boost something like this block. For Paddle Faster and Board the Ship, if we don't have ways to get that Go Again to string our allies together, we can still utilize them to give a 0-4 Go Again, which is nice value, right? Or Board the Ship a 2 for 6 overpower. So altogether, his minions are looking quite scary, right? He's just dripping with gravy, essentially. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting how exactly he ends up being balanced, because I'm not sensing a huge, big drawback unless his weapon does not have any form of Go Again. If trying to string together your allies' attacks becomes a big issue, although we do have those filler pieces, right? We have Flying High as one of the big new generic Go Agains, and I'm sure we'll have some Necromancer Go Agains for your allies to then string together those attacks. We also know that he's going to be a lot more in blue than what we necessarily see Dromai or Prism, with Dromai wanting a bit more red and Prism wanting a lot more yellow. So altogether, he's going to be scary. Right? Now, the only other card that we have revealed is Chart the High Seas. but Chart the High Seas still offers a decent amount of flexibility. So look at the top 2 cards of your deck, you may pitch a blue card from among them, and then put the rest into your graveyard and create a gold token for each yellow card put into your graveyard this way. So this could be a gain 3 resources, which is basically just pitching itself. You can activate Gravy Bone's ability if you get 2 blues, right? So pitch one and then graveyard the other blue. If you get a blue and a yellow, right? You could still choose to just graveyard both of them. You don't have to pitch one. You may pitch the blue. So in that scenario, you activate Gravy Bone's ability and you also generate that gold for a following turn, right? So altogether, he is really shaping up to be this high value hero that may break the mold, right? So I do hope there's something to keep him in check, right? Some way to deal with allies, maybe. A nice, easy, just burn the corpse and you don't have to worry about their health. But other than that, he's a 40 health hero who's going to get basically the full value out of his allies. So that is a lot of extra health. He is super tanky. And then he still gets value on the back end by their other utilization, be it swinging with them, their own personal effects, or dumping them into other cards. So yeah, Necromancer is definitely going to come out of the gate swinging, which is going to be a bit nicer than, how Contract Assassin ended up coming. But is it too good? That's going to be the conundrum, right? The only currently apparent drawback that I can see, right, is if you cannot block with allies. Since they don't have a block value, they only have the health value. They're not, two sides, so it's not an action or an instance into the ally. That way, when they're destroyed, the Watery Grave proc means that you can't replay them from the graveyard. So if you can't block with them and they're just essentially dead cards in your hand during your opponent's turn, then it might be the rationale for him still sitting at 40 HP and then soaking up the value of all your ally HP. But I don't necessarily know if that's going to be enough to basically keep him down, because he kind of seems quick enough in setting up, even without the fact that you can't search your allies, because you will be, taking multiple copies of them and you will be trying to cycle through your deck pretty quickly and still retaining that value, right? Rather than the general drawback of, I've milled, a third of my deck to find the pieces I want. It's instead, I've milled a third of my deck so that I can play them from milling them, right? So, yeah, Necromancer is definitely shaping up to be scary, and he is also the class out of the 3 that we know the least about so far. Anyway, let me know what you think. Are you excited for Gravy? I'm still Marlin first, Puff in second, right? And then we'll put Gravy on the back burner. But all 3 heroes are definitely shaping up to be nice, right? We're definitely back to ramping up in power each set, right? And then, yeah, the generic pieces to deal with A, draw, and B, some of these other interactions is definitely going to be interesting. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.